Hey, I think we can get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Melissa. I'm the Events and Engagement Coordinator at the Center for Civic Governance, formerly known as the Columbia Institute. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the Center for Civic Governance operates on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the traditional lands in your region. Today is part of our fifth annual conversation series for local electeds. The final conversation in the series, Local Climate Governance in a Shifting Political Landscape, is happening next week. We also have our annual Civic Governance Forum High Ground coming up in Vancouver at the Coastal Harbor Hotel on March 7th and 8th. I'll drop links in the chat with more info. I'd like to thank Foundation for a Path Forward, who are our partners in today's event. I'll share links for them as well so you can learn more about the critical work that they do. We will be recording the event today and we'll share the recording with everyone who has registered. I'm happy to introduce our speakers for today. We have Ankita Goyal, who is the Research and Communications Coordinator here at Center for Civic Governance. She is also a master's student in public policy at UBC, who is passionate about advancing equity and inclusion through policy and research. Ankita's most recent work has been with UNICEF, analyzing adolescent participation in social and civic initiatives in the Dominican Republic. We also have Yusuf Siraj from the Foundation for a Path Forward. The Foundation for a Path Forward is the province of BC's first official faith community convener, guided by a vision of a world where every community thrives, free from injustice and inequality. They work tirelessly to build safety, resilience, harmony, and wellness in every corner of society. We are so pleased to have them here today, and with that, I will hand things over.
Thank you so much, Melissa. What a wonderful introduction. Really appreciate you starting us off in such a good way. Folks, really honored to be here today. This is the culmination of almost a year-long research project, one of the first of its kind in British Columbia, looking directly at the impact that elected officials face from online harms, particularly those from a racialized background. I'm going to ask my dear colleague Ankita to share our slides, and we'll get right into the presentation today. Um, Folks, this challenge, for those of you who might not be 100% aware, is one of the most important and urgent ones of our time. It touches on so many intersections of social crisis, and it affects every single community. The program that we launched to address this in partnership with the Law Foundation of British Columbia is called the Inspire Project. It's looking at the development and understanding the inclusive networks and support that exists for public officials. As we said, particularly those from racialized backgrounds and in those in rural environments where support systems tend to be a little bit less. Um, awesome research done. Hats off to Ankita and the great team at Columbia for partnering on it with us. We really enjoyed working with them on the program. We're going to start with a land acknowledgement. And for myself, why it's important to do so is that in my faith, we pray 5 times a day. And an interesting tidbit that I always share is that prayers actually are invalid if it's done on stolen territory or while trespassing or in committing some sort of egregious affront to folks. What this means is that for me, acknowledging the land and principles of truth and reconciliation are deeply held and prioritized. To that, I'm honored to be speaking on behalf of Foundation for a Path Forward, hosted on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, downtown Vancouver, BC. Thank you, Ankita. Next slide. As we mentioned, the Inspire project came about through the funding of a grant provided by the Law Foundation of BC, but really builds upon a culmination of many years' effort, jointly done by Foundation for Path Forward and Columbia, which is obviously now the Center for Civic Governance. The challenges that we've seen in our communities affecting individuals, organizations, and institutions has grown to include even elected officials. What this means is that the online hate, the online harms that we see as citizens on a day-to-day basis, whether it's disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, hatred, or any of the myriad online harms, don't just affect us, they're affecting our elected officials. This project really came about in an effort to understand what that means for these elected officials, or for those running for government, or those who have left government because of them, and to see how we can address it in a systematic, and meaningful way. And next slide, please. We're always solution orientated. Research has to have a purpose in our view. Um, so just a quick shout out to my dear and awesome colleagues, Tarek Tayab, co-founder of Foundation for a Path Forward, Isabella Johnson, Senior Program Officer for the Center for Civic Governance, Melissa Gregson, Events and Engagement Associate, Center for Civic Governance, and of course, Ankita Goyal, Research and Communications Coordinator for the Center for Civic Governance. A bit of a tongue twister saying that back to back, but these are just names on a board, but the people behind these are some of the most impactful folks in BC, doing great work for our organizations in Canada and actually around the world. So I'm honored to be here and included on this list. Next slide, Ankita. So when we were thinking about how to actually go about this program, we decided on a few specific outcomes that we were hoping to achieve. Number one was to really deepen our organizational understanding, because our organizations work in this day to day, right? So, of how systemic racism and online harms are actually impacting racialized officials beyond just the word of mouth or secondhand research published in other places, like from the United States or the EU. But in British Columbia in particular, how is this affecting our electeds? The second point is to say, well, okay, if we understand it, now what? So how can we support racialized leaders, or really anyone, to thrive in the political sphere in a meaningful way based upon our shared values? The third point is really to highlight gaps in existing resources. This was a very interesting one for us because one of the things that we found was that there's a lot of resources, but they're either not being accessed, people are unaware of them, or how they were being utilized wasn't effective. And that's probably the easiest way to improve this situation, is to make better use of those. The fourth goal was to identify factors that contribute to safer and more inclusive governance spaces. Okay, now see, this one was very interesting because trying to understand from a from an active point of view, like what can we actually do? There are certain factors we came across that can be implemented right now to support elected officials in office today, as well as those who are planning to join, or maybe who, because of these problems that we're going to identify, think that they can't do it or they shouldn't do it. So how can we rectify that? And lastly is to develop a research-informed toolkit, which, surprise everyone here is going to help participate in towards the end. We have a special breakout room session just for you guys to look at how we can really drive this long-term equity development and digital safety and governance. Everyone on the call is here because you care, right? You have an interest in seeing this come to fruition, and because collaboration is built into our DNA, we're excited to work on that together. Next slide, please, Ankita. Or do we have our video coming up? The roadmap, beautiful. So, folks, this is an overview of what the research project entailed. We always start with our intention. Like, why are we doing this? Who is it going to benefit? Who is it going to harm? And who are we not having at the table? So to do that, the best way is to always have community stakeholder engagements. We work with consultants, we work with community leaders, we work with experts in the field to bring together shared understandings and perspectives. Again, it's maybe a little cliched, but it's important principle for us is nothing about you without you, to include consultation from racialized communities, from elected officials, and from the broader government, the broader community as a whole. We did a great literary review. Again, as I mentioned, see, the most of this stuff comes from the US or EU, which there's nuances and differences that not necessarily are best reflected here in British Columbia. Some of it is Canadian, but it's not specific to the target area that we were looking at. but it did help to contextualize the broader global challenges that communities and elected officials everywhere are facing. We then finalized the survey, which many of you on the call actually received and participated in, and for that, a huge thank you. Your time was appreciated, your effort was appreciated, and your wisdom is appreciated, and it is reflected in our final report as well as in our practical outcomes. We then went through the interview process, distributing the survey, conducting the interviews with folks, and then looked into data compilation and analysis from a few different angles, actually, because we got some really good research data. I think there's even enough for 2 or 3 different reports looking at different intersections and interesting outcomes of that. So that would be cool to look into. Hint, hint, any Law Foundation funders on the call. And then, of course, today we have our presentation for you guys to engage and to be the first recipients of the outcomes of this report. And we're going to look at working on the final report and toolkit with a bit of development from everyone here. So I'm going to pause here and turn it over to Ankita to share a bit more and then guide us through the remainder of this part of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Yusuf, for that introduction and for your leadership, and specifically in spaces where these conversations need to happen. Thank you so much for that. And before we dive into the findings, I wanted to take a moment to bring us into the experiences that shape them. So we know that research at its core is about making the invisible visible, but it's also about looking at structures around us and asking, who do they serve? Who do they overlook? And through the Inspire project, like Yusuf mentioned, we've engaged with local electeds across BC, mapping the challenges they encounter, but not as isolated incidents, but as systemic conditions that shape their political and personal life. To our surprise, many described a trajectory that was remarkably similar: the decision to run, the campaign, the experience of governing, and so on and so forth. And we know that research often presents finding in structured ways through reports and numbers, and we have that. But numbers alone cannot do justice and fully capture the depth of what a lot of people and local electeds have shared with us. So, from our experience, we've come to know that the weight of navigating these roles, specifically as a public servant, is also about how it feels, how it accumulates over time, and also how it shapes the ability to govern. And yeah, we could have simply listed the findings, but doing so also risked stripping them of interconnectedness that makes them systemic. Instead, we created this video that will show just right now, not to dramatize or not to generalize, and certainly not to represent any one individual, but to reflect the collective realities that so many have voiced. So basically, this video is an attempt to look at what was shared with us and presented in a way that mirrors the complexity and the patterns that exist beneath stories. Of course, please be reminded that your own experiences may differ and that this is completely valid. This is not meant to be a singular narrative, but rather reflection of broader systemic conditions that continue to shape political and personal life of a lot of electeds. Also, please know that some moments in this video may feel familiar and others may not, and some may affirm what you've lived while others may raise new questions. And please also know that if any part of this feels difficult, please take care of yourself in whatever way you need to. This is a space for reflection. And also, as you watch the video, I invite you to consider some questions. First, which part of this reflects your own experience and which don't? Second, where have you seen systemic barriers reinforced and where have they been challenged? And lastly, we'll be talking more in the toolkit part of it, but also think about structural interventions that would shift these patterns. With that, let's take a look at the video.
Disclaimer: this video is meant solely for research purposes. It represents themes drawn from qualitative research and interviews with local elected officials. It does not depict any one individual, but reflects common experiences and systemic challenges faced by local elected officials in British Columbia. Stepping forward, nobody grows up preparing for the weight of leadership. The decision to run isn't just about policies or governance. It's about proving you belong. For some, the journey starts long before the first debate, long before the first policy is drafted or the first speech is given. It begins with quiet doubts, whether a last name that's unfamiliar to voters will hold them back. whether a different background or a different way of speaking, make them unfit to lead. Some step forward and are met with open arms. Others must fight for every inch of recognition, working twice as hard, building credibility, proving again and again that they deserve the seat at the table. And when the time comes to run, there's a moment of hope, a moment that says, maybe this time will be different. The campaign, but the moment a candidacy is announced, the conversation shifts. Suddenly, the race isn't about policy, it's about identity. It's about how someone looks, who they love, where they come from, what they believe. Doubt is no longer just internal. It is broadcast, spread, amplified. Rumors circulate. Names are twisted. Lies take root. The campaign stops being about connecting with voters and becomes about defending existence itself. And while some candidates run with the full force of institutions behind them, others find themselves standing alone. Party support becomes selective. Allies disappear when the attacks begin. The very leaders who encourage them to run are nowhere to be found when things get difficult. Public appearances become unpredictable. Speeches are interrupted. Events require security. Some debates are about policy. Others become interrogations. And yet, through all of this, they keep going because they still believe in the reason they ran. Governing. Winning an election doesn't mean the fight is over. It means the fight is just beginning. Inside council chambers, the rules are different. Decisions are made before meetings even start. Most important motions are buried at the bottom of the agenda. Some voices are heard, others are cut off, interrupted, dismissed. The weight of expectation is suffocating. One mistake is proof of incompetence. One misstep is ammunition for critics. Successes are overlooked. Credit is given elsewhere. Outside, the scrutiny never stops. A policy decision in a small town can make headlines across the country. A statement on one issue can ignite a firestorm on another. Personal safety becomes a daily calculation. The job doesn't just affect the person doing it. It affects their families, their children, their sense of security. But now, this is the price of public service. This is what it means to serve. And then, a crisis. Not in the council chamber, not in their city, not even in the country. Somewhere in the world, an event unfolds, and suddenly a local leader finds themselves at the center of it, accused of ties they never had, assumptions made about their loyalty, words twisted, threats escalated. The response? Silent. Institutions look away. Colleagues avoid eye contact. Law enforcement dismisses the danger. The message is clear. Endure it or leave. The cost of staying. Service is called a privilege. But the reality is staying in office has a cost. Not just in resilience, but in access, in resources, in survival. For some, holding power is an extension of wealth, a natural step in a long career. For others, it is an uphill battle against systems that were never built for them. The ones who stay learn to choose their battles, to compromise, to lower their voice so they don't seem too angry, to accept that sometimes the only way forward is to go slow, to hope that change, real change, outlasts the exhaustion. And those who leave, their work is erased, their policies reversed, the cycle resets, the system remains unchanged. This is not just one story. This is not just one voice. This is the reality of too many who enter public service believing in change, only to find themselves fighting a system designed to keep them out. If we want real progress, we have to ask, how do we not only elect leaders, but ensure they can serve? How do we not only encourage diversity, but protect those who embody it? How do we make sure that those who step forward don't have to stand alone? Because if we fail to answer these questions, we're not just losing candidates. We are losing the possibility of something better.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching the video. So the basic idea was just to have a more narrative-driven approach to the stories that we have heard so far in the project. I know it can be heavy to see the realities presented so directly, but thank you so much, everyone, for your patience. It means a lot to us. As we move forward, I'd like to share this journey of understanding and how it began for the Inspire project. So before we started collecting data, we grounded our work in through a very thorough literature review. This step was not only critical for identifying key trends, understanding gaps, but also to situate our research within the existing academic and policy discussions. Let's look at some of the themes that came out from the literature review. So, firstly, ASI introduces the concept of privation of inclusion, which basically describes how systemic racism excludes individuals from meaningful opportunities and decision making spaces. While this research was primarily focused on workplace environments, we saw a clear parallels in governance. Like many local electeds told us about being excluded from informal networks or key conversations, often having to work harder to prove the legitimacy. This particular theme reminded us to ask in our project, how do governance systems unintentionally reinforce exclusion, and what can be done to make these spaces more inclusive? Secondly, Laming and Valentine's work highlighted for us the impact of online racism, particularly for public figures. They argue that while anonymity does increase online abuse, the deeper issue lies in societal biases that these digital platforms amplify. We did see this reflected in our own survey, which we'll be sharing later in the presentation. And as we know, the recent incidents in BC, such as coordinated online attacks against leaders, further highlight the urgency of this issue. And third, Curry's research on racially restrictive covenants provide a historical lens on systemic racism in housing policies. We know that these covenants are no longer legally enforceable, but their legacy continues to shape wealth distribution, community dynamics, and by extension, governance here in BC. As we see this underrepresentation of racialized leader from historically marginalized communities, this particular theme pushed us to think critically about how historical injustices continue to affect access to power and resources today. Lastly, Nathan Allen basically examined how vague criteria like culture fit and limited access to mentoring opportunities create barriers for racialized individuals in professional spaces. Although this particular research focused on workplaces, the dynamics mirrored in governance. This theme specifically again raised important questions for us, that how do we move beyond tokenistic representation and create systems of meaningful participation? So, all in all, I would just say that this literature review had set the tone for how we approach the entire project. We saw the importance of intersectionality by examining how race, identity, and other systems interact to shape experiences. But again, there was a major gap. There was no study or lack of research on how these themes specifically affect local governance, not even in BC, across Canada, which we sought to address through our surveys and interviews. Uh, Talking about the development of the project, we knew that understanding systemic challenges required more than just asking questions. It demanded an approach that respected complexity, the context, and the lived experience of many. After all, the research is not really about just finding answers. It's more about asking the right questions and being open to what emerges. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel, Yusuf, from the very start, intersectionality has guided our approach. We recognized that the challenges faced by local electeds are shaped not only by race, but by the ways race intersects with gender, geography, and socioeconomic factors and other identities. To understand this fully, we learned on in-depth qualitative methods. We wanted to hear the stories behind the data, the nuances that number alone cannot capture. And at the same time, we knew that we couldn't ignore history. So historical analysis, as it's mentioned in our approach, was also central to it. Again, like Yusuf mentioned, community engagement and stakeholder consultations was a cornerstone of our research. We faced challenges in representation, particularly from smaller communities where electeds work in isolation and under heightened scrutiny. And we did try to address it with targeted outreach. And also for a research process, we made sure it was trauma informed and culturally sensitive. Again, accessibility wasn't a secondary option, it was central. From diverse recruitment strategies to accommodations tailored for every participant. We did try our level best to ensure everyone who wanted to participate and share their stories do so meaningfully. And talking about toolkit development, this webinar itself is a part of our toolkit development phase. The toolkit is intended to go beyond reflection. It's meant to be practical, customizable, and sustainable as a resource for helping you all thrive in office. And yeah, we also know that research is not static always. So if you think something is missing from the approach and if there's a perspective we've overlooked, we'll welcome your input. Please let us know. Okay, talking about the survey, this survey was the first step in our methodology. This was designed to map the systemic forces that shape governance for local electeds. By capturing these patterns early, we were able to identify and refine our approach for the next phase of our research, that was interviews. And uh, this basically informed our research throughout. So, again, if you were one of the contributors, thank you so much. And if you haven't had a chance to participate yet, we would love to include in your perspective as well. I guess we'll be sharing the survey link in the chat. So please do fill it out whenever you can in your own time. And talking about the key areas of an inquiry in our research and survey was specifically first demographics and representation, just to understand who our contributors are and the environments which they serve. And then we also identified challenges and experiences. And then we also looked at impact and coping mechanisms, just to assess the emotional, professional, and structural toll of these challenges. And then we also evaluated what institutional and peer based support exists and what gaps remain. And lastly, we did try to understand how existing structures enable or hinder meaningful participation. Let's get into the findings of our survey. So, talking about demographics of it, our contributors represented a diverse cross section of governance. So talking about ethnic and racial diversity, over half of our contributors identified as BIPOC. And also, talking about gender diversity, women made up the majority of respondents, as you can see, alongside contributors from men and non binary participants. Also, responses came from officials serving in urban, suburban, and rural communities across BC. So, this demographic lens allowed us to identify patterns of exclusion and representation. But still, we do remember that uh, some voices are still missing in the data set. And this is a limitation that we are still addressing through our ongoing engagement. Okay, so before diving into the data, I also want to acknowledge that the weight of what we are discussing here, systemic racism, is just not about overt actions or explicit exclusions, as we know. It's about the structures, the policies, and the cultures that perpetuate inequities in governance spaces. So, when we asked contributors about their experiences with systemic racism, the numbers, as you can see, are stuck. Around 70% reported encountering systemic racism during their time in office. Breaking that down for you, 12.1% faced it daily, and 24% monthly, and 30% a few times a year. But again, these numbers don't exist in isolation. Let's look at what systemic racism actually looks like in governance. As you can see in the graph, workplace microaggressions were a recurring theme, which contributors also described as constant scrutiny and also subtle undermining that also came across as being spoken over in meetings, dismissed when proposing ideas or questioned about their expertise. And nearly 30% cited exclusion from decision making processes as a recurring issue. This aligns with the broader theme of leaders being invited to spaces but not empowered to lead meaningfully. And then we also have unequal media coverage that came up frequently, with contributors sharing that their leadership was basically framed through a lens of identity rather than accomplishments, reinforcing biases about who belongs in governance. And I would say once insight that struck us deeply was the prevalence of discriminatory public feedback. So, how voter criticism was not about policy, but about race, identity, or background. These stories reminded us how public office for racialized and for all local electeds often means carrying the weight of both governance and societal bias. We also, through our interviews and through our research, noticed gaps in institutional response to these challenges. So, a lot of contributors spoke about feeling unsupported, especially in smaller municipalities where resources are already limited. These findings also underscored that we need structural reforms that dismantle the barriers of our leaders rather than just asking them to endure. Let's look at online harms and digital threats related to identity. As we know today, in the age of digitalization, systemic racism extends beyond in-person interactions. It has growing presence in digital spaces. Social media, for instance, as we know, has become both a platform for engagement and a site for harm. So, as you can see, our survey revealed that 66.7% of our officials experienced online harassment. And here's what uh, looks like for them. So, as you can see, the most reported form of online harm was targeted social media harassment, with a lot of leaders receiving direct, often personal attacks on their identity. And secondly, spreading misinformation was another major issue. Contributors described instances where false narratives about their policies and about even their personal lives were amplified online, eroding trust and credibility among their counterparts. And also, many face cyber stalking and hate speech, where private information was shared publicly, putting their safety at risk. What's particularly alarming about this data is the lack of institutional mechanisms to address it. Contributors shared throughout with us that when they reported harassment, that they were often met with inaction or just told that this behavior was part of the job. The normalization of digital abuse creates an environment where leaders must constantly balance their visibility with vulnerability. And to think about it, it's just not exhausting, it's also so silencing. So, these findings highlight the urgent need to have systemic accountability measures in digital spaces as well. Next, our survey looked at impact of racism and online harms. So, when we talk about uh, harms like these, it's easy to focus on the external barriers, but what about the toll it takes on the individuals who serve? So, a survey found that around 27.3% of our contributors reported moderately significant impacts on their personal well being. But again, through our research, we've come to know that behind this number, there are stories that go far deeper. So, a lot of contributors shared and spoke of their emotional exhaustion of having to constantly prove their legitimacy, mostly doing it under a microscope where every mistake is either amplified and every success is minimized of theirs. And many local electeds also shared with us that how the stress and scrutiny impacted their families, particularly when online harassment spilled over into their personal lives. And again, burnout was a recurring theme throughout, with some officials questioning whether they should or they could remain in roles which felt so isolating and unrelenting. And again, without addressing these root causes of harms, we do risk losing not just individuals and local electeds like you, but also the communities and perspective they represent. Talking about coping, despite these challenges, we know that uh, it's been more than just about surviving, but also finding ways to sustain yourselves and your communities. So here's what our survey revealed about coping strategies. So as you can see, around 40% leaned on family support as their primary source of resilience. For many, family provided a space for process and recharge away from the pressures of public office. And as you can see, a lot of people also turn to hobbies and exercise that just emphasizes the importance of maintaining a sense of balance and well-being. And as you can see, a lot of people also sought professional mental health support, highlighting the growing recognition of the need for trauma informed care in leadership roles. But again, these particular findings also reveal a critical gap. the burden of, again, systemic exclusion is placed almost entirely on individuals. Contributors repeatedly have pointed to the lack of formalized mentorship programs, peer networks, or institutional supports, basically saying that there is little to none. And this also reinforces a key takeaway from our research, that resilience is not just a substitute for structural change here. Okay, so here's what our contributors told us needs to change. So they spoke about stronger anti-racism policies that go beyond surface level commitments and address systemic issues head on. And they also spoke about formalized mentorship and peer support networks. And again, they also spoke about formalized mentorship and peer support networks, and also about institutional accountability for online harassment with clear mechanisms for addressing digital abuse and protecting leaders from harm. And encouragingly, around 57.6% of contributors noted that there have been improvements in inclusivity over the past 5 years in their particular community and municipality. But again, these improvements also come with the questions, are they sustainable? Are they structural? And this is where the next phase of our work comes in again. This insights from a survey has directly informed, like I said, the research process that took after that, the development of a toolkit, and the interviews. And now I'd like to pass it over to Yusuf, who will guide us through the next steps of this conversation. Thank you for your patience, everyone.
Thank you, Ankita. That was awesome and a very effective rendering of our work. It's beautiful to see that this came about through a collaboration with most of the people on the call, actually. That a lot of us guys like put our time and effort into this. And again, thank you, Ankita. You did beautifully. Folks, the next step here is where we're going to break out into a couple breakout rooms. One will be facilitated by Ankita, and one will be facilitated by myself. The intention here is to really think about what we just heard, as well as compare it to our lived experience and knowledge and vision, and together help inform some of the direction of the toolkit that we are developing for every elected official in BC. Actually. So it's going to be, I think, is it going to be automatically separated, Melissa?
Yes, yes, it will.
Sure. So I think we have the link in the if anyone needs to log off, no worries. Your time and your presence with us are extremely appreciated. If Ankita, do we have that link again? If we can just repost it into the chat for everyone, just to have it at the top, the bottom of the chat, so that we can make sure that folks have the tools necessary. Yeah, thank you so much, Rob. Really appreciate it. And folks, again, we might actually also send out an email with this link so that for those who had to hop off, if you wish, you can also contribute that way. We're going to solicit feedback and support from folks to help understand this in a good way over the next week or so. All right, so here we are, the Survey Monkey League. So yeah, Melissa, please feel free to split us up into groups, and we can go from here, guys.